Welcome to the SEESOX annual lecture, which is the most prestigious event of Southeast European Studies at Oxford. And I'm Othon Anastasakis, the director of SEESOX. And we are delighted, myself and on behalf of colleagues at the Southeast European Studies and the European Studies Center, to welcome Ivan Krastev, one of the most distinguished and well-known intellectuals, political scientists, political philosophers. Lots of labels I'm giving you. And it's great because Ivan is a very good friend of this college. He's been here as a visiting fellow in 1991 during the first years of transition to democracy in Eastern Europe. And so he knows the European Studies Center even before us during those incredible times. And then he's been coming back, and he knows personally also many of us and has worked with them. And it's very special to have Ivan talk to us today about the current state of democracy with a question mark in Europe and beyond, and the predominance of majoritarian politics. Because this has been a core subject in our work at SEESOX, and we've been studying this for the past, obviously we've been studying comparative politics of Southeast Europe since the inception of SEESOX in 2000, but during the recent years we've been basically looking at and observing at the permutations of illiberalism in the region from an academic and intellectual perspective, but also from an activist perspective, I can say, when we are really looking at things that are turning quite sour in our region. So in this context, we have benefited from the experience of high-quality academics who are in-house people at SEESOX, but also guest speakers. And our seminar series, and the seminar series during the last term, which was on illiberalism, did study issues like the rise of nationalism and populism, the new geopolitical realities in Southeast Europe, the weaker leverage of the EU, or the increasing illiberal influences coming from abroad, and how all this has been impacting in the rise of strongmen in the region, or polarized party politics, populism, the failures of civil societies, and in the economic sphere also the rise of socioeconomic inequalities. Now, in many ways, Ivan's talk today is this culmination of our thinking during this academic year, of exploring these new political trends, or maybe not so new, especially according to Ivan, who's been studying these phenomena for a long time and has been writing about pluralist democracies and democratic transformation. Indeed, Ivan has been among the scholars who, from the early years of what we all assume to be some form of benevolent transition to liberalism, he emphasized the weaknesses of young democracies in Eastern Europe and their inability to build trust, to offer real choices to the people, or the inability of citizens to affect policies through their vote. The doomed revolts that took place in the recent years in the Balkans, and now examining civil unrest in countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and the significance of current migration, this migration moment in Europe, and how this exposes cleavages and the clashes within the countries. Some may attribute Ivan's skeptical and critical view to the fact that he's Bulgarian, because Bulgarians are the more pessimistic people in Europe. Of course, now you compare with the Greek neighbors in the south. But what is more important about Ivan's work is his ability to look through politics with a clear and astute mind, without being hostage to definitions or pre-packaged, sometimes frozen paradigms, but with an imagination to explore and create innovative ways of looking at our liberal or maybe post-liberal world. So while I would not like to categorize Ivan exclusively as a Bulgarian or a Central European political thinker, still the fact is that he's got this important perspective from that region as well. And from our perspective, the Southeast European perspective, Ivan, you are one of the most exportable Southeast European scholars globally. So Ivan, just to present him, Ivan Krastev is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Studies in Sofia. He's a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, where he lives and works, and with distinguished fellowships in various universities, as a von Weizsäcker Fellow in Berlin, or his fellowships here in the 90s. He is the founding board member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the advisory board of the Erste Foundation, and a member of the advisory council of the Center for European Policy Analysis. From 2004 to 2006, Ivan was executive director of the International Commission on the Balkans, which was chaired by the former Italian Prime Minister Giuliano Amato, and that produced one of the most influential reports on the Balkans and the European perspective of the countries. Ivan's books include, in English, Democracy Disrupted, The Global Politics of Protest, In Mistrust We Trust, Can Democracy Survive When We Don't Trust Our Leaders, The Anti-American Century, and Shifting Obsessions, 3 essays on the politics of anti-corruption. His latest publication, After Europe, has been getting raving reviews under this provocative title. He looks at the European reality today and the prospects for the future. The Sunday Times had a very nice review this Sunday. I will give it to you, Ivan, in case you haven't read it. Here you are. Thanks to our friend Robin who brought it for you. So congratulations on your recent book. We are all looking forward to reading it. But most importantly, we're looking forward eagerly for you to tell us about Europe, democracy, and the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I felt already guilty when on this weather, basically, I was forcing you to be within the room. After this great presentation, anything that I'm going to say is only hurt me. It's not going to be the presentation as interesting as the introduction. But basically what I'll try to do is the following. There is now a major debate, and people are saying, we see the decline of democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, all these titles about the authoritarianism going up. You have a lot of studies, and I'm going to quote some of them, of the growing mistrust of democracy. In this presentation of mine, I'm going to argue something which is much more simple. First, I don't believe that thinking in terms of democracy, authoritarianism helps us much understand what is going on. And secondly, I'm going to argue that what we are going to see as a result of certain type of backlash against globalization that we are facing is not so much going to lead to a rise of a classical authoritarian regimes, but the democratic institutions, which in the last 25, 30 years we assumed are much more working as including certain type of minorities and other social groups, are going to work the same type of institutions, very much excluding these groups. So we're going to end up with a much more majoritarian type of regimes. So, and in order to make this very kind of a simple argument, I'll try to basically try to look at certain, in my view, important changes that are taking place in the European politics in the latest years. In his beautiful novel, Death with Interruptions, Portuguese writer José Saramago talks about a society in which suddenly people stop dying. Nobody died in March. Nobody died in April. Nobody died in May. And certain euphoria started. Nobody was dying anymore. And then after this initial euphoria, problems, metaphysical, practical, started to appear. First was the church. If nobody is dying, nobody is going to resurrect. But then came the insurance companies. If nobody is dying, they're dying. And then there were people who have been taking care of a very sick and old parents, and they started also to feel very much depressed because it means that it's going to be forever. So in a certain way, a smuggling channel was created in which this type of old and sick people have been smuggled in the neighboring countries in which people are still dying. At the critical moment of the book, The prime minister goes to the king and said, Your Majesty, if we don't start dying, we don't have a future. I'm saying this story because in a certain way, this beautiful story, and by the way, there is not much in the novel of what politically is happening in this country. We don't know what are people on the streets and what are 5 scenarios that they have been preparing. But the story is that I do believe Europe's experience of globalization in a certain way very much resembles the problems that no death society is facing. If you see one of the most important elements of the current crisis of European perception of the world is that it is exactly what we loved yesterday is the one that we fear today. And this is open borders. And from this point of view, this is very much this changing perception of how globalization works, how it works for Europe, how this affects people, that in my view is a very important part of the changes that I'm going to talk about. So from this point of view, probably it makes sense to look around and to go back to some of the assumptions of how this global world is going to work. I know that now everybody is referring to Fukuyama's The End of History, and now people are kind of trying to ridicule it. But here's the question. If the article was so stupid, why people were so much fascinated by it? And I'm talking about the article, I'm not talking about the book. And remember, it was 1989. Soviet Union was still there. So from this point of view, obviously we can agree or disagree with Fukuyama, but obviously he has captured something critically important for the time in order his view of the end of history to become such powerful, particularly when it was such an abstract language that does not easily fit to the best-selling type of article. And it's not by accident that I'm saying that Soviet Union was still there, because to a great extent, this new post-Cold War liberal order that people were very much trying then to conceptualize did not assume the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In a strange way, Soviet leader Gorbachev liked something about postmodern, post-sovereign idea of Europe and basically the world, because this was an argument against the rising nationalisms within the Soviet Union itself. I'm saying this because one of the important things that makes, in my view, Fukuyama's article so important was that it was not simply based on an intellectual argument, it was based on a shared assumption that we face a change in the way politics and society works, which is not simply coming from the fact that the bipolar world is over, that the major ideological alternative to democratic capitalism is over, but also all these technological changes were making people feeling that we are entering in a new world. He was thinking very positively and progressively, but the feeling that we are at the edge of something which is totally new, where history is not going to help us much, is something that I do believe was very much shared by others. What is interesting about his book is very much about his article. His article is very much about the free movement of ideas, of goods, and capitals. There is one word which is totally absent from the End of History article, and this is migration. In his view of the world, ideas move, capital moves, goods move, but people don't. And from this point of view, democratization was his explanation why people are not going to move, because basically people are going to change their own countries, and the process of democratization was very much there. Secondly, what was critically important is that according to him, the major question that the West was facing after 1989 was how the West is going to transform the world, what we should do, what kind of policies. The idea that this change is also going to transform the West was not something that basically was very much spelled out. The age of history was the age of imitation. Others are going to imitate the West. By the way, Fukuyama is a much more serious social scientist than people pretend he is, so he was not naive that everybody basically is going to succeed. But he was saying everybody is going to be forced to try to imitate Western institutions. In the way on the marketplace, people try to imitate the most successful companies, basically in order to get competitiveness. And this lack of an alternative and this age of imitation basically was the way he was perceiving it. At the same moment when he was writing his The Age of History, or to be honest, a year later, another book was published, much less discussed, and to a certain extent sharing the idea that we're at the end of history moment, but this book was very much reading the end of history differently. You know that Francis Fukuyama was a Japanese American, very much educated in Chicago. In the moment when he was writing the book, he was working for the State Department for the policy planning. And I do believe that culturally, probably the fact that he was Japanese American makes sense to believe that imitation works and the copy can be better than the original. Japanese know how to do it. But there was another maverick American professor staying in Berkeley who wrote the book The New World Disorder. And this was Ken Jowett. I don't know how many of you know the book or the person, a person who basically spent most of his life also studying the Cold War, but for him, and he spent 2 years, I do believe, living in Romania, he was very much interested how the models coming from the center are transformed, imitated, mimicked, faked in the periphery. So then he was very much interested how the communist model was done there. And how basically it was transformed. So on the basis of this experience, he wrote a piece in which he is saying, Fukuyama is right, there is no alternative, universalist alternative to the democratic capitalism, but where he's wrong is three things. First, when the end of the Cold War starts to change the world, first is going to change the non-Western world, but then the change is going to come back to the West. Secondly, he said, or at least this is how I'm reading what he's saying, I don't want to put it in, Ken's responsible for this, imitation, both successful and unsuccessful, always produce resentment. The failure produce resentment for very obvious reasons, but even successful imitation produce resentment because imitation is asymmetrical relationship from the power point of view. The original copy relationship is now the relations between equals. And where basically Fukuyama believed that others are imitating you because they want to be like you, Ken Jowett suspected that others are imitating you because they want to beat you. So from this point of view, the reflex to imitate is very often the reflex of the loser. But this is not simply because he wants to be transformed and basically to become the copy of somebody else, but he believes that basically by imitating he can become stronger and he can also reverse a certain type of political developments. I'm saying this because in my view, it is critically important to understand that what happened is that with this crisis of globalization very much can be seen with Brexit, with President Trump being elected, with all the problems that we see all over Europe. The question how the end of the Cold War has changed us is replacing the question for the West, how the West is transforming the other part of the world. And this is going very much to affect our understanding of democracy. There was recently, Yasha Monk, a Harvard researcher, published an article, 2 articles in fact, in the Journal of Democracy, in which working on the data of the World Value Surveys, basically he has demonstrated that at the same time, when democracy was expanding geographically and we have a much more democracies all over the world, support for democracies has been declining in the most of the advanced Western democracies, and particularly support of democracy, and I'm talking about democracy and not simply mistrust in a particular democratic governments, we're talking about democracy as a system, is particularly weak among the younger generations. They don't believe that democratic frameworks allow them to make a change. So how to make sense of the fact that this globalization of democracy basically started to weaken and question the democracy in the countries in which it started, basically it's originated and how it works. And for me this is a critical question, because now there is a lot of talk what is happening, for example, in the US or what is happening in Poland and Hungary, and we're always trying to reduce this to a certain type of a specificity for these countries. We're trying basically to explain this either in the context of post-communist transitions or Polish specificity, Hungarian specificity, and of course there is specificity. But to what extent there is a general trend? In the way there was a trend in 1989, and we saw the trend, to what extent we see a trend and what is this trend? And from this point of view, I do believe that one of the important things that is allowing us basically to see how the change is taking place is to look much closer to the migration crisis, which came with the refugee crisis. I'm using refugees and migrants as synonymous. I know that neither from legal, nor from humanitarian, from any point of view, this is to be justified. But what I will try to basically stress is something that is very much about the nature of the borders and democratic regimes. Why I'm saying this and why I said that the open borders is basically the things that European Union and Europeans were most in love with and most scared with, and why it's so difficult for us to talk about the current crisis. When the best and the worst is the same, you don't have a language. Because at the moment when European Union says that the open borders are a problem, then how the very idea of the European Union is going to be justified? When you're going to say that open borders are not a problem, then a huge part of the population is not buying this anymore. So how and to what extent the migration crisis explains, to a certain extent, helps us to explain what we are seeing in Europe today. I'm saying this, and I'm going to define migration crisis not simply as the flow of people coming from outside Europe to Europe, which became very much visible during 2015. For me, the migration crisis is also the migration of voters, the migration of political identities, and the migration of arguments. If you basically look simply at the number of people that entered European Union during 2015-2016, it's not a number that is mind-blowing. It's enough to see how many people are in Turkey these days out of these refugees, even I'm not saying Lebanon, so you're not going to understand why the war of 2-3 million people produced basically such type of a crisis. But at the same time, you can see that even in the countries in which you do not have any refugee, the migration policy and the refugees started dramatically to change national politics. And we have a new actor which is very much dominated European politics today, and I'm going to call them the threatened majorities. These are ethnic, religious majority groups that starts to feel the vote in the way normally minorities feel. They feel persecuted. They have the feeling that the situation is not under control. And the idea of being under control was critically important. And from this point of view, if till yesterday, the identity politics, which was very much tolerated by the liberals and the left, was a very much characteristic of the minority groups, what we see also in the United States, but also in Europe, is the identity politics becoming the major characteristic of the majority groups. And I do believe this is very much changing the way our democracies work. So why and where these problems come from, and why I see the migration crisis is so important. And I want to stress once again, in my understanding, the migration crisis is Europe's 9/11. It is not to be reduced to the actual problem some of this country face with migration. Just give you one Slovak data to understand why you cannot do it. In Slovakia, in this famous year, 2015, 168 persons were the refugees that entered the country and asked for asylum. 8 people got it. On the basis of this, you cannot understand how it is possible that anti-migration right-wing party basically has reshaped the national politics, and basically you start to have with anti-migration minorities. So from this point of view, when I talk about the migration crisis, this is very much how the migration crisis changed the political imagination of Europe. It's not so much what is happening basically on the level of day-to-day politics and integration. But it changed it in a big way, because I do believe something important that Europeans understood or felt was that in a global world, migration is the new revolution. and that in this sense, Europe very much discovered itself as a counter-revolutionary power. Let's try to argue how it works in my view. In 1981, when the colleagues in Michigan for the first time did this world value survey, they have shown that back then there was no strong positive correlations between economic wealth and happiness. Back then, Nigerians were as happy as West Germans. 20 years later, they have been, as you know, they're repeating over time the same type of a survey. They figured out that there is a growing positive correlations between GDP and happiness, and the Nigerians now basically are as happy as their GDP is going to predict. What has happened? One of the things that has happened is that Nigerians got TV sets and also internet. Globalization is totally changing the framework of comparisons. In a certain way, the global world is the world of global comparisons. If yesterday you're comparing your life with the life of the previous generation, with your neighbor, with your peer, more and more you start to compare your life with the people who live best. I mean, freer. It's not only about economic prosperity, it's also about freedom. And then what you start to discover, particularly in a globalization in which nationalism has lost some of its appeal, and this paradoxical result of the decline of nationalism and this heroic understanding of belonging to nation is that what people understood is that if you want radically to change your life, the most radical thing that you can do is not to change your government, but to change your country. Because changing your country, you are changing the political regime within one generation. And at this very moment, the European project basically get the most important, in my view, almost philosophical challenge to itself, because deeply European Union is rooted in the Enlightenment idea of the universal citizenship. But the idea of the universal citizenship assumes two things. Either the world is populated by free and democratic countries which nobody wants to leave, or we're going to exercise our rights nevertheless of our citizenship, which means that everybody can go where he wants, including Europe. Inability to reconcile this type of a contradiction, in my view, led to the situation in which the European politics started very much to change, and that's when I talk about the change of voters, the first thing that we discovered is that at the moment in which the migration came as the defining crisis of the moment, the left-right distinction does not work anymore. The blue-collar workers massively migrated from the center-left to the far-right. 85% of the blue-collar workers in Austria voted for the far-right president on the second round of the presidential elections. You saw this during the Brexit, basically, vote and others, because the post-Marxist left, which does not believe in the idea of the global revolution, does not have any reasons to be internationalist. In a certain way, now the far right is the Workers' Party, because the Workers' Party are very much hurt by the globalization, so both economic and cultural protectionism is very much there. But secondly, what is also extremely important, what is not simply the movement of the voters, but also the movement of arguments. In the 1970s, many leftists and liberals are going to argue that different type of traditional and national communities in the third world have their right to resist globalization and modernization because they have the right to preserve their way of life. Now the same argument comes from the wealthy middle classes of the West. They also claim that they have the right to preserve their way of life. And the third thing that I do believe is becoming particularly strong in my part of the world is something that I want to define as the demographic panic. Because also what migration made clear is that there are not many Europeans in the world today. Europeans is not at the center of the world, that demographically this is aging and shrinking part of the world. And this is which theoretically people probably have heard before. It was never very much shaping their behavior, and now it started to do it. I'm going to give you a Bulgarian example in order to understand why in countries in which they're not basically refugees, you have a total obsession with the migration problematics, and why migration problematics is totally changing the nature of the political conflict and the nature of political identities of parties. Bulgarian society is a small society, around 8 million people. According to the UN demographic projections, in the next 25 years, we're going to lose around 27% of our population because of aging and also because of people leaving, young people looking for better opportunities, some of us being here. And the question is that if you're living in a country with such a prospect, the idea of ethnic disappearance become depressingly real, and because we are talking about quite secular society in which religion is not a major factor, you have a totally different understanding of your own mortality. Because when there is no God, it was the idea of an everlasting nation that gives you an idea that you're never dead because you're going to be remembered. You're going to be remembered for what you wrote or for what you did. This type of a metaphysical fear combined with a technological fear that we're living in the world where there are not going to be jobs for you, started to create, in my view, what I find the most dangerous part of the current political landscape in Europe, and this is fear of the future. Europeans started to fear the future. And this is why most of the populist parties, in their essence, they're nostalgic parties. It's not by accident that it is make it great again. It's very much returning to the situation which it was. It is not very much about the project that it is going to be built. From this point of view, one of the major characteristics of the current day populism, particularly on the right, far right, is the following. You have a national mobilization in the absence of a common project. From this point of view, this is very different than romantic nationalism of the 19th century. This is a different type. It's very defensive. And also it's very much a consumer-friendly type of populism. Normally classical ideologies don't people in the way they are. Neither communists, no kind of classical Christian Democrats, they're going to like the people in the way they could be. Not about populists today. By the way, this is one of the strengths of President Trump. He goes to people and said, I like you in the way you are. You're stupid, I like it. And I'm not so much ironic towards President Trump. The basic problem is that this is also how the market makes these people feel. Because the market all the time is telling you, I like you in the way you are. I don't want to change you a lot. Nobody has the right to change you. Nobody has the right to ask you to be better than what you are. Be authentic. So from this point of view, you have a populism which also very much fitted to the way the market works. And basically this type of a new consumer citizen has been created. So if you go back to the classical nationalism of the 19th century, you're going to see that the citizen was also a soldier, not simply a voter, he was a worker. He has a totally different relations to the state. The other source, and from this point of view, Central and East European example is a great example. And I'm going to give the example of Poland, because Poland goes against some of the major interpretation of the sources of current European nationalism. Listen, most of the people with a good argument, nevertheless, that as you know, there was a study coming from colleagues in Harvard showing the cultural factors are more important than economics in explaining the populist wave in the world today. But many people are going to try to reduce the problem of populism to the economic difficulties that come with the financial crisis. It's not true for Poland. Poland did not have recession. And in a certain way, Polish economy, like some other East European economy, has been developing a lot. Of course, there are losers and winners, and of course, nobody basically can say that it's a no-problem economy, but you're not going to explain the fact that one of the most pro-EU public opinion in Europe voted for a government which is openly critical to the EU and basically even can put in question Poland's role in Europe. And the second, for me, much more important question is how it happens that Polish public that is mistrustful to political class and to concrete politicians in general is ready to allow one political party and one political leader to dismantle the separation of power system and allowing huge concentration of power in one place. Why people who mistrust politicians do not defend separation of powers? From a classical liberal perspective, this is a major paradox. But my interpretation, and I do believe this, at least in my view, has a lot to do with my understanding where the appeal of the populist parties come from. If we believe that separation of power is the way to keep politicians accountable, from the point of view of the person on the street, separation of power in the last years has become a way and alibi for governments to basically say why they cannot do this or that. I cannot do it because of the courts. I cannot do it because of the European Union. You cannot be responsible, keep me responsible for this because I cannot do it. So paradoxically, the dismantling of the separation of power in the eyes of the voters who voted for these parties is not the way to reduce accountability. They believe that they can keep the political leader accountable only if he's going to give him the whole power, because he does not have any excuses not to do what he's doing. The only problem with this, as you know, is that when you give somebody the whole power, you cannot be sure that he's going to return it to you. But otherwise, there is a certain type of a logic, and this logic cannot be dismissed. I'm saying this because, and I do believe this is very clear also in the case of President Trump. This is very clear in the case of Hungarian and Polish case. The major accusation of the populist leaders with respect to the liberals that in their eyes is governing the world after 1989 is that they are not simply basically weakened the role of the borders between states, but they totally destroyed the border between victory and defeat. One of the strengths of liberalism is that when you are defeated, for example, electorally, you are not destroyed. You go back, you're going to go back to the elections, you can regroup, your rights are going to stay there. But from the point of view of many, this is not the real victory, because you cannot be really victorious if the other side is enjoying their status. And then comes President Trump, who said, listen, how it happens that America has been victorious in the Cold War and we have a deficit and Germans has a surplus? This is not how victory works. If you're victorious, we should have a surplus and they should have a deficit. And the same with Japan and the same with others. And then Mr. Kaczynski, who is saying how it happened that it was the anti-communist revolution in 1989 that was successful, and this is the post-communist elites that are living better than us. And then the idea that victory means not simply that we all have rights, but I have a much more privileged position than you, because this is what victory is about. Traditionally, victory is going in the street and the first 1 week, nobody is asking what you're doing. I do believe this idea of victory is very much at the heart of some of the populist message. We are not kind of promising anymore that everybody is going to be okay. We are promising you that the only way we to be victorious, you who are voting for me, is that others are going to suffer. And I do believe this is why, while people believe that this type of a confrontational politics is going to work against these parties, it can also help them. Because this is a classical going back to the Schmittian understanding of politics as friends and enemies. And from here on, I want to move basically to my last point. And this last point is the following. How then we can see the future of democracy if this type of a populism basically is attacking the most important nature, the most important kind of legacy of 1989, and this is the nature of the borders. Because if you go back to Europe, you're going to see that after the World War II, the idea was that empires are going to be disintegrate, so we're going to move the borders in order to create states which are much more legitimate in the eyes of their own people, self-determination principle. And then after World War II, the idea was probably we're not going so much to change the borders, but we are going to exchange populations with the same idea that you're going to have a much more ethnically homogeneous states, and in Central and Eastern Europe this was very much the case, which is going to give much more legitimacy. The interesting story about the change in 1989 was we are not going to change the borders where they are. We're also not going to exchange people forcefully, but we're going to change the nature of the borders. Borders are not going to matter in the way they basically mattered before. And what I do believe we see is a very strong attempt to try to restore the borders in the world in which restoring borders is not so easy. Do I believe that this talk about physical borders, starting with Mexican border in America, going to the Bulgarian borders on the Bulgarian-Turkish border, do people really believe that this is going to stop somebody? People are not naive. But for them, this is at least the understanding that people want to change the nature of the border. The same goes with the trade policies. Protectionism is becoming a commonplace in most of the countries. So from this point of view, everybody is saying that TPP and President Trump goes against it. Candidate Hillary Clinton also declared that if she is going to be elected, she is going to dismantle it. So we start to have a new consensus on the nature of the borders. Ken Jowett, in his 1991 book, tried to distinguish between three different types of borders. First, he called frontiers, and he had a very, he's a very interesting idiosyncratic man with a very colorful language. So he said, frontier borders, and this is the borders in the time of globalization, they're like a singles bar. You go, you take a drink, you even pick up somebody, you have a one-night sex, you don't ask for the name, a lot of experience, no identity. And then he said you have the barricades as a different type of border, and this is like a Catholic marriage. You marry, but there is no divorce. It is us versus them. It's giving a lot of identity, but no flexibility. And he very much was basically arguing that the boundaries are kind of a normal borders in which you can basically marry, which means that you get identity, but also you can divorce if you are not happy, and this change is what the liberalism stands for. I do believe that we are moving from this type of a frontiers to a barricade mentality where people really start to dream about a totally different type of borders. Some of them are dreaming this being the borders of the European Union. Others are dreaming this being the borders of the nation states. But there is a major common understanding that the nature of the border should change. And the most difficult borders, of course, to be reconstructed and to be restored is the information borders. And this explains basically all this total obsession where you can see everywhere with hacking, interference in domestic politics, electoral process. By the way, this also explains the huge popularity of a government-sponsored conspiracy theories. Because at the end of the day, conspiracy theory is nothing else than basically trying to recreate information borders, not allowing others to influence you. And believe me, this process is going to become even more intensive when in 10 or 15 years, some of the smartphones that you have and I don't are going to work also as interpreters. So now everybody can basically reach you on your natural language. So the governments for the first time lost one of their natural privileges. And this is a privileged access to your own citizens and voters. Through the big data, and the way the translation process changes, the level of interference in other people's politics everywhere is becoming totally different. So saying all this, I'm going to end on the following. Unlike some people who basically are trying to describe this process that I have been basically arguing as the rise of authoritarianism, and they're going to say, no, we are not going to see people voting anymore. You're going to come up with the authoritarian leaders. And they, in a certain way, going back and try to imagine very much the authoritarian regimes from the 1930s. I do believe that we are seeing something which is much more subtle, but it does not need to be more pleasant. And this is basically the following. You're going to have a democracy who are not simply going to make very strong distinctions between the majorities and majorities which are not going much to respect minorities. And when I say minorities, I mean also political minorities. I'm not just talking about cultural or ethnic or religious minorities, but also we're moving to the regimes in which, and from this point of view, I do believe that the speech of Prime Minister Orban, who was with me then, in Oxford in 1991, basically was very important because we're talking about the political regimes which are stressing the need for overwhelming majorities, which means that not being part of the majority basically means that you're excluding yourself from the very definition of nation. You cannot be a true Bulgarian if you're not part of this overwhelming majority. And I do believe these political regimes, they're not going to abolish elections. And they're going to keep many of the institutions of the liberal democracy there, but the functions of these institutions are going to be totally different. If in our view, democracy was very much perceived in 1989 as being synonymous with liberal, and I mean pluralist democracy, we're going to move to something which is going to be much more the majoritarian type of democratic regimes, where the identity of the regime very much goes with the identity of the state and the identity of the nation. And from this point of view, arguing with these regimes are going to be much more difficult because they're going to have a popular support behind them. So I'll stop here. Thank you.